In Matthew chapter 24, in Matthew chapter 24, let's start with verse 6 and 7. Jesus is talking in this Olivet prophecy to his disciples. He has the 12, and he's talking to them privately in verse 3. And they ask him questions: what will be the sign of the end of the age? And what will be the sign of your coming? And Jesus gives them the answer. But remember, he's talking to disciples. Those individuals who are not followers of Jesus Christ, who do not have God's Holy Spirit, will not understand these passages. They just won't. They can read it, but their eyes will not comprehend, their mind will not understand what they're reading. But Jesus gave a step-by-step analysis in general as to what the conditions would be at the very end of the age. He said, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. You see, all of these wars and rumors of wars are simply the overthrow of governments for this end-time beast system that's rising. So when all of these activities in the war area is over, then they will establish their one-world government. Then this Antichrist system is going to establish peace. And the whole world is going to think the Messiah is here. But it's going to be a false Messiah. It's going to be the Antichrist. And it's going to be an individual who is so going to duplicate the very prophecies of Jesus Christ that the world will accept him as God. And he'll move into the temple of God and claim to be very God. That's at the end of all of these wars. Verse 7, for nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in different places. I just wanted to mention this as an introduction to my sermon today, and I've entitled it, The Truth About the Philippines. Because you see, V.I. Lenin made a statement in 1917. He said, first we'll take Central Europe. Then we'll take the masses of Asia. Then we'll surround the United States and it'll fall like an overripe grapefruit. Now, while we in the United States of America have been sleeping in the last 70 years, and we have been asleep in this country, we could not realize that there would be a threat to our security. We couldn't visualize that a threat to our security because we have 3,000 miles of oceans separating us from any of the other continents other than Central America leading down to South America. And yet, after the communist takeover in 1917, we've seen Outer Mongolia, Inner Mongolia fall to international communism. We saw Manchuria, and we saw other northern provinces of China fall to international communism. And then by World War II, there was a secret agreement, because you see, those who had infiltrated into our White House and into our State Department totally controls our foreign policy and works in concert, consistent agreement with international socialism all over the world. As a direct result, during World War II, there was a grand design drawn up by Joseph Stalin and by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, okay, we'll establish at the end of World War II a United Nations organization. This organization will be our grand plan for a one-world government. And then Stalin said, okay, we'll join this organization, but you've got to do something for me. You've got to hold your troops up once you enter into the war. You've got to hold your troops up until we can rearm ourselves after the German devastation at Leningrad. And so the United States entered the war to defeat Japan. They also entered the war in Europe, came up through the boot of Sicily, and they sat there for 2 years, barely moving a mile a day, until Stalin was rearmed. After World War II, this agreement, this grand design by the two of them, then took fruition. They worked out a bargain where they could create a world government through the United Nations, and one of the first steps would be that they would hand over to Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union after World War II Central Europe. Therefore, they would complete their program, first of 3 phases, for world domination. As a direct result, immediately after World War II, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia were the first three nations to go into the communist orbit in Central Europe. They started their systematic program of genocide and destroyed the cultures of all three of those nations. They also took Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Albania, and East Germany. All of those went as Central Europe into the orbit of the Soviet Union. Also, this grand design was, how could the Russian expand their empire as long as Germany and Japan on the west and east end of the empire were intact? So the grand design drawn up was that they would totally defeat Japan with unconditional surrender. And they would pass laws in the world courts and so on to dismantle Japan forever as a military apparatus. And do we see, even till this day, 30 years, 40 years after World War II, has Japan any military? No. They're a technologically advanced nation because the United States of America, we financed their rise to world power economically, but would not allow them to have military equipment. And then on the other end, the west end of the Russian Empire, was Germany. They said, we must destroy Germany, split it in half, so that it will never rise, at least for 100 years, to world dominance and power again. And so it has not risen, as many people in prophecy have thought that it would. Germany is split in half today. West Germany is in the NATO alliance, but it is not a world power as the United States and the Soviet Union is. So their grand design was achieved, and we can see it today in retrospective because it is fulfilled to the letter. Everything they laid down in their grand design happened. Then all of a sudden, there was a man by the name of Mao Zedong who was a communist, and he had established a communist stronghold up in northern China. And Chiang Kai-shek, who was a loyal, he was trained in America, he went back to China, he was trying to destroy communism. And Chiang Kai-shek was told by the State Department of the United States they must go into a coalition government with a communist. If they didn't, the United States would cut off all military aid to him. That's exactly what they did. Because Chiang Kai-shek knew that international communism would be a slave labor movement. The elite would rule and everyone else would be slaves. And they would exterminate half the population of every nation they ever take over. And they're still doing it to this day. So in 1949 and 50, China, the Republic of China, fell, and now it's communist China. Then we had the outbreak, the border outbreak going across North Korea into South Korea. The Korean War was underway, financed by the socialists in Russia. Also, at a later time, the Chinese came to the aid of the Koreans. They told the United States and all the peacekeeping troops of the United Nations organization that if we went across the 38th parallel, Communist China would enter the war, and they did, in massive millions of troops. So Korea, North Korea has fallen into the communist orbit. Then you found South Korea a decade later. Suddenly there was war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail and so on. And now Vietnam has become a stronghold in the Orient for international communism. The United States went there as a peacekeeping outfit with the United Nations organization. Every single head of the military apparatus of the Soviet or the United Nations organization, by agreement when it was established, is always a communist. And there has been 11 Russian communists and 1 Yugoslav communist. Every move the American Army made had to be given to a communist field general 24 hours before the move was made. Now do you understand why we could not win the war? And they wouldn't let us use the military might we had. We could only go out to put down a brush fire war. And so after they went in, the United States, with your tax dollars, my tax dollars, multiplied billions of dollars was spent to build up airstrips, airfields, army bases, naval bases, deep seaports, all over South Vietnam. Then the United States withdrew with its head between its tail. The United States did nothing but build up the Orient and then withdrew because international communism had no money to build all of these facilities. And so now all of Southeast Asia belongs to international communism. Little Tibet fell to China. And now there's something going on in the Philippines right now. And I think we need to know about these things. And since the toppling of Ferdinand Marcos, who was for 20 years the president of a young nation called the Philippines, the United States liberal communications media have been in a state of ecstasy, in that they are slanting the news media against Marcos in every way they can in order to bring him down, which they have now done. He was an anti-communist. He was one of the last bastions of anti-communism in all of Southeast Asia. And yet the liberal media in the United States of America has now brought him down without a bullet fired. After an election on February 7th of 1986, which was still inconclusive after several days, they hadn't counted all the ballots, the United States on February 25th extended recognition to the new Filipino government headed by Mrs. Corazon Aquino. And yet there was no official declaration as to the winner. And yet we recognized them, this new government. And we offered Marcos asylum in the Hawaiian Islands. And Ferdinand Marcos and his family now are residing in the Philippines. Marcos flew to Hawaii in one of our United States Air Force planes on February 26th. And yet the ballots had not even been completely counted. Who is responsible for the overthrow of governments for international socialism? The greatest nation on the face of the earth, and those who have infiltrated every nation on earth in secret, the Illuminati. And they have such control of the mass media in the United States as practically a 100% blackout of all truth in this country to brainwash you and me into believing whatever they put forth for us. They don't want you to know that these anti-communist governments are there, and they're on the side of the United States of America. Now, since February, the United States mass communication media has been plastering our country with stories concerning the 3,000 pairs of shoes by Mrs. Marcos and all the designer dresses. That's all you hear, the furs that she had and she bought. Let's face it, every dictatorship on earth is corrupt. Every one of them. There's not one that's not corrupt. The dictator is out for his own interest. And yet, on the other hand, these anti-communist dictatorships are for America. Now, there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that Ferdinand Marcos, who was a dictator, was corrupt. All you have to do is look at the millions he stashed away in banks, Swiss banks and so on, and you know he was out for number one. But he was anti-communist, and he had the leader of the founder of the Communist Party in the Philippines in prison, never to be released, and others also. Now, Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was our former ambassador to the United Nations, she stated recently that of the 159 members of the United Nations organization, at least 100 of them are, and I quote her very words, worse governed than the Philippines. None is more important to the stability and security of the United States, Japan, and other independent nations in the Pacific. End of quote. At least 100 out of the 159 nations in the United Nations are worse governed than the Philippines. And yet they had to destroy the Philippines because it was one of the final factors in keeping international communism from taking the entire Orient. But because many of these worst governed countries are communist controlled, remember that, there was no outcry in the liberal press in the United States against those governments. They only cried out against the Philippines, just like they're crying out against South Africa right now. And yet South Africa, as I've already reported, is the number one affluent nation for all blacks, not just whites, in the whole continent. And there's more freedom in that one country than all other nations put together on the continent of Africa. And yet our mass media must brainwash us to think the opposite so they can overthrow them for international communism and a one-world government. Now, while President Ronald Reagan and leading officials of the administration, they exchange congratulations on their roles of virtually a bloodless transfer of power in the Philippines, there are questions that are still unanswered by them, such as, what is the future of the two strategic military bases in the Philippines? We have two strategic bases, the American Air Base at Clark Field and our naval base at Subic Bay. And these are the keys of American protection of freedom in the entire Orient. And they're the only thing that is keeping international communism from coming across the Pacific Ocean and invading the west coast of the United States. And loss of these two bases would push major American defenses halfway back across the Pacific Ocean to Hawaii. So the Soviet Union definitely wants these two bases on the Philippines. Now, in a column written March 2nd, 1986 by a Mr. G. Russell Evans, I quote, "The new and politically naive President, Corazon Aquino, now exuberating in the heavy air of high popularity, repeatedly vowed during her campaign," listen to this is what she vowed, "to eventually remove Subic Naval Base and Clark Air Base. She also promised a non-aligned coalition government and wooed the comrades of the powerful communist New People's Army for help." Do we see what's happening? The United States of America and the mass media call for the resignation of Marcos. They flew him into exile and they put up a puppet, someone who is very naive, knows nothing about government, as they always do in every nation, and all presidents of the United States also. And then she called for the removal of the United States bases there, and they would be a non-aligned nation with either communism or the free world. And then she is going to allow a coalition government between her government and communism. It's an absolute fact of history. Every single nation that's become a coalition government with communism has fallen within 3 years to international communism. Not one has ever survived. While United States liberals, they are literally basking in sunlight, you might say, over the deposing of an anti-communist government of Marcos, they never mention once the guerrilla activity in the Philippines by international communism. They never tell about this New People's Army that is literally creating chaos in all of the islands of the Philippines. And they've now established several of the islands as total communist. There's an editorial that came out in the Indianapolis Star. It stated this, quote, "Marcos' sin should not mislead Americans into thinking that Filipinos would be better off under communism. The mass slaughter, iron regimentation, and ferocity of a communist dictatorship would make Marcos seem saintly by comparison." Now, any of you who have studied in the last few years about international socialism, you have become acquainted with the absolute fact that they believe in the Global 2000 report of reducing the world's population in half by the year 2000. That's why every nation they overthrow for communism, they start a genocide program. And they wipe out half the populations of every nation they enter into. And those that they don't actually exterminate half the population, they make such restrictions as families can only have one child. And then they start exterminating the elderly people to reduce the population. And anyone who is born with a birth defect. And that's exactly what they've got planned for the United States of America. Now, what is the importance of these United States bases that she's so willing to run us off of in the Philippines? The United States actually relies on these two bases to extend its military umbrella into the Western Pacific and Asia because their spot on the globe makes them absolutely strategic. Absolutely strategic. This is the Clark Air Base in the Philippines and the Subic Naval Base. And together they're the largest United States military complex outside of the United States itself. The Clark Base sits on a reservation that totals almost 131,000 acres. And the Subic Bay Base, it sits within a 36,000 acre district in the Philippines. Now the bases are home for 15,000 sailors, Marines and airmen, and about 23,000 Filipinos are dependent upon jobs at these two bases. And they also provide for about 43,000 dependents of these military people in the Philippines. The United States bases there provide over $300 million a year to the economy of the Philippine Islands. And without that economy, they would not even exist at the same standard of living which they have today. So you see, if those two bases are exterminated from the United States of America's use, that means the Filipino people are going to be down in a quagmire of poverty once again. So the purpose of the bases in the Philippines is to provide a place where United States ships in the Far East and in the Orient and airplanes and their crews can go for repairs, supplies, training, and they are actually to protect all the way from the Hawaiian Islands and our Pacific coast. Now strategically, the Philippines stand as a United States bulwark against the Soviet naval forces in the Western Pacific. And I think this is interesting because today, United States aircraft carriers, battle groups have patrolled since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And they've been patrolling the entire border, and it's the Pacific Fleet that is patrolling that part of the world. And if we didn't have the bases there, how could they patrol for your and my security? They couldn't. February 3rd, 1986, in an issue of the New American magazine, this is what it stated about Senate Intelligence Committee. Their statements, quote, "The advent of a major Soviet air and naval presence in Vietnam after the withdrawal of the American forces in 1975 gave Clark and Subic a new importance as the southern anchor of American power in Asia." You see, we built up the Vietnam ports, and when we withdrew, the Soviet Union moved in. That's exactly the way we've done it all over the world. We go in and build all the military facilities, withdraw, and allow the Soviet Union to come in and take up the vacuum where we've withdrawn. Today, and I'll continue the quote, United States naval and air operations extend westward from the Philippines as far as the Persian Gulf. Forces based at Clark and Subic are responsible for protecting the flow of oil and other commerce through the Indian Ocean, the Strait of Malacca, and the South China Sea. Those same forces are central to the defense plans of the pro-Western states of Southeast Asia, plus Australia and New Zealand. If the United States is forced out of the Philippines, there goes New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, and all Southeast Asia. The only thing that will remain will be Hawaii, and then the United States, sitting over here as an island in the world, and the rest of it communism. Also in a column on March 2nd, which I quoted from before, Mr. Russell Evans had this comment, I quote, "The Soviet expansion of naval forces into the Pacific, presently estimated to be twice the tonnage of the United States 7th Fleet, and their acquisition of operating bases has been phenomenal since the American withdrawal from Vietnam. First prize," now this is what the Soviets took over when we withdrew from Vietnam. First prize was the $2 billion United States-built Cam Ranh Bay military base with docks, warehouses, and airfield. Now, for some $1.5 billion per year, the Vietnamese allow the USSR unrestricted use of and improvements to the former U.S. facilities. This is incredible. that we go along with your tax money, my tax money, we build these facilities, withdraw, and hand it over for full use immediately by the Soviet Union and all of their military apparatus. And this Mr. Evans went on and pointed out that the Soviet operations out of Cam Ranh Bay, only 900 miles from the Filipino islands, and in the warm waters, you got to remember that, warm waters of the South China Sea, are a far cry from the often ice-choked port at Vladivostok, which is 3,000 miles to the north. You see, the Soviet Union for a long period of time had no warm water ports, and they had to expand through the Mediterranean and the Baltic Sea first. And now they've secured all of these ports since they've overthrown other countries and set them up as satellite nations. Now, from the Vietnamese bases, Soviet ships, aircraft, and submarines can now control strategic choke points, and they can monitor every major sea lane in the Orient. Now, through Vietnam, the Soviets have a foothold in Cambodia. So they're going to take Cambodia. Now, the Soviets have the capability of surveying the Strait of Malacca, that's between Singapore, which is British control, and Indonesia, which connects the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. So this is very vital to all the oil shipping lanes through the Persian Gulf. And if the Soviet Union controls them, there goes the minerals and the oil that is shipped, 50% of it to the United States and to the Western world. Now, in the article I've already mentioned in the New American, the author stated that Reuters News Service reported last October that the port in Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam had become the Soviet Union's largest overseas naval base. The largest. You and I built it with our tax money. And by the government that we have supposedly put in office, and they swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And if they did not uphold the Constitution, then they could be tried for treason and shot in a military possession. And yet nothing is ever done. That's why the security of the world right now is hanging in the balance as to what happens in the Filipino Islands and in Central and South America right now. He also went on to state that up to 30 Soviet warships visit Cam Ranh Bay every month. And they always have 7 to 8 warships docked there at any one time for protection. And a squadron of 16 Tu-16 long-range Badger bombers are based there all the time. And he said a squadron of 14 MiG-23 Flogger jets and 3 Tu-95 Bear reconnaissance aircraft and 3 other Tu-142 Bear anti-submarine aircraft are all based at Cam Ranh Bay. And we built it. Now, John Chamberlain, in his column of February 12, 1986, here's what he stated, and I quote, "The Soviets have decided to match and exceed United States naval power in the Pacific." Exactly what they did in the Mediterranean. They have 800 ships in Pacific waters, and they keep Badger bombers at the Cam Ranh Bay airport in Vietnam, which give protection to the 30 Russian warships and submarines which prowl the South China Sea. The Soviet Cam Ranh Bay base is just 2 hours in flying times to the Philippines. 2 hours. And that's all. And the Philippines could be gone. Chamberlain went on to warn, and I quote, there is a so-called New People's Army guerrilla force in scattered Philippine islands that has Marxist sympathies. Subversion in the Philippines combined with the Cam Ranh Bay threat is aimed to impress the Filipino politicians of all parties with a need to propagate the communists by ousting the Americans from the naval base at Subic Bay and the Air Force at Clark Field. So this is nothing more than a show of power to tell the Filipino politicians to get the United States out of the Philippines. Now, on December 26, 1984, Mrs. Corazon Aquino, who is now the new president of the Philippines, and more than a third of her cabinet signed a declaration of unity. And this statement stated that the foreign, I quote from that declaration, foreign military bases on Philippine territory must be removed, and no foreign military bases hereafter allowed, end of quote. This has already been signed on several occasions during her campaign, and this was not put before the American people, so we wouldn't know about this, but those in the news media over there know about it. She strongly suggested that she wanted the United States military bases out of the Philippines. And on March 26, 1986, she promised United States Special Filipino Envoy, or our ambassador, Philip Habib, that she would honor the lease rights agreements through 1991. But after that, she went on to say that she would keep her options open. We know what those options are. Bye-bye, United States. Now, Mark Lewis of the Washington Inquirer News Service, he wrote in February, I quote, "The hard core of Mrs. Aquino's following is communist." Now do we know why Marcos had to be deposed? I'll continue the quote. "The communists have abolished elections in every country they rule. They originally intended to boycott the Philippine election unless she capitulated to their demands. She capitulated. She gave in to everything the communists demanded, so they turned out by the millions to vote her into office. She said she would seek a neutral Southeast Asia and a non-aligned status. The Organization of Non-Aligned Nations is dominated by anti-American and pro-communist regimes." So if the Filipinos become non-aligned, that just simply means we're on the side of the communists for world takeover. That's all it means. I'll continue the quote. "Another demand Aquino met was that known communists be permitted in her government if they renounce violence. This means a coalition government which almost always has been a way station toward a totalitarian communist regime." End of quote. Now, I think this is very interesting because since that time, Mrs. Aquino has freed every single communist and communist sympathizer in the Filipino islands. On March 5th, President Aquino, acting in what she called a spirit of reconciliation, freed the founder of the outlawed Communist Party, the former chief of its military wing, so that's the two top officials, and two other top communists. Those that were freed were Jose Marie Sison, 47 years old. He was the one who founded the Communist Party of the Philippines in 1968. And he led its armed struggle until he was captured and jailed in 1978. Also released was Mr. Bernabe Buscaino. He was the former leader of the party's armed wing. And he now is in charge after his release of the New People's Army once again. And two of the other men who are released, I'll not mention them, but they're a part of what they call the Sparrow squadrons, of their assassination squadrons for the communists there. And there's no restrictions on their movements at all. They're now free. Now, an Associated Press reported, this is an article that came over the Associated Press on March 17th. I quote, "Military officials said Monday they let a freed communist field commander meet with his armed comrades. And state television, that's in the Filipinos, reported the bloodiest rebel raid since President Corazon Aquino took office." End of quote. Immediately after these raids were released, they started a reign of terror in the Philippines again. They will overthrow the Philippines for communism. And it is prophesied in the Bible. This red government is rising all over the world. Now, Channel 4, which is the government-owned television station in the Philippines, said that 23 people were killed in the assault by over 100 communist guerrillas of this New People's Army. They said that They had raided a warehouse so that they could secure food for their armies. And so far, this was about 250 miles north of Manila in the Philippines. And they said that they killed about 15 of the guerrillas themselves. Now, I want to skip down to another quote, and I think this is quite interesting, because this Mr. Sison, who founded the Communist movement and the Communist Party in the Philippines, has already had the opportunity to speak at the University of the Philippines. And this is interesting. He's been jailed for 10 years nearly, and now all of a sudden he's released, and he's already been a guest speaker at the University of the Philippines. Here's what he said, quote, "No revolutionary will give up what he's already won." They're not going to pull back and say, "We'll be nice to you Filipinos." They said they will never give up the land territory they've already overthrown. Before a ceasefire can be arrived at, we must recognize that the revolutionaries will make certain demands to improve pre-dialogue conditions. End of quote. He says he'll demand of the government certain conditions before he'll sit down and talk peace. This is the way the communists always do. They'll take 2 steps forward, pull 1 back when the pressure's put on them, but then they'll take 2 more forward. Meanwhile, they're gobbling up the land masses and the people. I'll give you another quote now. This is by Mr. John Chamberlain in his article I've already mentioned. Quote, "Turmoil in the Philippines may do more for the Soviets than the offshore presence of some 400 Russian ships in Central Pacific waters. We could be pushed out of the bases from within the Filipinos by a successful communist coup." End of quote. These things are serious. This is Bible prophecy taking place. Revelation 17 stated that a scarlet-colored beast would rise, and with it would be certain individuals. It would be a great religious organization that would also work hand in glove with it. And in the Filipinos, which is nearly 100% Catholic, that is exactly what's happening right now. But now, the question is, who is making United States foreign policy that can actually overthrow governments? Foreign governments. When it is literally against the law for anyone in the United States to meddle in the internal affairs of foreign lands. So who is it that is making all of these policies for the overthrow of these countries? There's only one way to understand what's happening around the world, and that is to recognize the increasing power of certain policymakers of our government and a government in England and in Western Europe. And in the United States specifically, it's called the Council on Foreign Relations. In England, it's called the Institute for Foreign Affairs. The Council on Foreign Relations was originally formed for the very purpose of taking control of American foreign policy from the government and for the benefit of the international banking fraternity. International bankers. And they supply funds for both sides of revolutions. Both sides. That's a historical fact. Mr. Carroll Quigley, in his 1,000-page book, Tragedy and Hope, he stated, because he was an insider for over 20 years inside the Council on Foreign Relations and the Illuminati, and he went over their books for many years. He said they finance both sides for world revolution. So no matter who comes out the winner, they control them through money and finance. But its aims, this Council on Foreign Relations, has been considerably expanded since it was founded in 1921 in the United States. Since then, they are promoting a one-world government of international socialism. This means that they want to control all money in the world. They want to control all the minerals and raw products of the world. They want to totally control all food of the world, and they want to redistribute it in all nations of the earth so there will be equality of all people all over the world. In short, their goal is to create a new world order. In the book of Revelation, it's called the Beast. And they control totally from downtown London, England, in a place called the City, which is an independent city just like the Vatican in Rome. all the finances of the world. They control the economics of the United States through the Federal Reserve System because they own the stock, the Bank of England and the Rothschilds of the Federal Reserve in the United States of America. Nothing is done in this country until orders are given by downtown England in the city. And they are the ones who are financing international socialism and communism all over the world right now. They also want to overthrow the sovereignty of the United States. They want to reduce all of our constitutional freedoms to slave-like conditions. They want to eliminate the middle class and all the educated classes and only have a few millionaires who are in consistent agreement with their purpose of world takeover. These are the individuals that literally control the media in the United States. They control the foreign policy of the United States. They control the destiny of nations as to whether they'll remain free or fall into the one world new order network. President Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981. Some of the following people made up his appointments to the cabinet positions. Secretary of State became Alexander Haig, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Secretary of the Treasury was Donald Regan, Council on Foreign Relations member. Secretary of the Defense, Caspar Weinberger, Council on Foreign Relations member. Haig was later replaced because of problems he had with the president. He wanted to run the government. Ronald Reagan wouldn't let him. And so he was replaced by George Shultz as Secretary of State. It just so happens that George Shultz is one of the biggest members in the Council on Foreign Relations. Also, Mr. Regan now has been replaced by James Baker III as the Secretary of the Treasury, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission members. Now, both Shultz and Baker are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. You can actually send off to an address which I can furnish and get the entire membership of these organizations. Senator Barry Goldwater had this to say in 1979. I quote, "In their pursuit of a new world order, they're prepared to deal without prejudice with a communist state, a socialist state, a democratic state, a monarchy, or an oligarchy. It's all the same to them. To be exact, the greater the dictatorship in a nation, the greater they love it, because they have absolute control of that nation under a dictatorship." The February 28, 1986 issue of Don Bell Reports had this to state about the Philippines. Quote, "To these elitists," that's the Council on Foreign Relations, "it doesn't matter that an anti-communist, pro-American government has been replaced by a pro-communist government. And if the fall of the pro-American government of the Philippines means the eventual loss of Clark Field and Subic Bay, this merely means that more billions," this is dollars now, "will be made with the building of new air and naval bases on Guam, Okinawa, or elsewhere." End of quote. So you see, it doesn't matter. You can go into nations and bomb them to ruins, and they don't care. They're happy about it because then they extend loans, and they rebuild whole nations and cities. And then those nations and cities are indebted to the international bankers. It's money. That's the name of the game. And so it is, if we lose our bases in the Philippines, we'll just have to build new bases. Where does the money come from? Not $1 in the United States of America ever goes into existence unless our government creates interest-bearing bonds and borrows it from the Federal Reserve System, which is a private monopoly. I want to hold up to you right quick two different kinds of bills. One of them is a Federal Reserve note, and it states right on it, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." That's all it says on it. Now I want to hold up another bill for you, and this is quite interesting. And it states right on it, this is before 1934, and I carry it everywhere I go. "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money." The Constitution of the United States says only gold and silver, and it even specifies how much is in each of the coins. And that's redeemable. It's lawful money. This money that we carry around in our wallet today is not lawful money. It is nothing but fiat money. And they use it so that they can just create a debt for every nation, so that we'll overspend, because see, when you have hard currency, which is backed by gold and silver, you only have enough gold and silver certificates in circulation as the amount of gold you have. And then if you're out having a war somewhere, when you run out of money, you've got to quit fighting. But you see, in order to have world chaos and constant wars, then all you do is you have paper money, so that all you do is print more. And when you run out of money to fight a war, you just print more and send it over to them, and you keep fighting. And that way it causes all nations to have wars and cause them to fight themselves into exhaustion and say, somebody please come to our aid. We want peace. This is what's happening in the world today. International communism. But it is a satanic plot. That's what we've got to remember. It's Satan doing it. He's only using tools. And those tools, we cannot hate them. We cannot dislike them at all. To be exact, when they bring us up before kings and they send us to prisons and so on, we have to speak exactly what God's Holy Spirit gives us at that time to convict them of their evil, but they can go ahead and kill us, it doesn't matter. But at least we have done what we are supposed to do. So we can see from all of these quotes that I've given that it's the Council on Foreign Relations that is the one who is actually supplying all the finances, the mass media for the downfall of the Philippines. And it's already happened. Now, I want to go one step further, briefly, because the Bible literally forecasts all this. Why is this military apparatus that's going all over the world called red? Revelation chapter 6, it tells us, verse 4, or verse 3, and when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, come and see. And there went out another horse, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, that was red. And power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth. That's constant war. And this is a red horse that's doing it. That they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. Doesn't the Soviet Union today have the greatest sword on the face of the earth outside the United States? And now they've even surpassed us. I want to give, in my closing statements here, just short information to show how this international red horse, this war machine, was brought into existence. If Russia were dropping bombs on American cities today and all over the Western European Empire, we would actually arm ourselves, we would go to war with them, and we would destroy them. But because they haven't come into our own territories with war machinery in Western Europe and the United States, then we haven't armed ourselves against them. No, without American technology and data that we have passed on to the Soviet Union, they wouldn't be able right now to have vehicles in space. Only because the United States of America gave them and furnished them through the United Nations organization a transfer of technology do they have the capability of putting vehicles in space. They have missiles targeted against Western Europe and the United States right now, and all of the computer chips in their heads and so on were supplied by United States companies and those who build ball bearings, and they built whole plants in the Soviet Union so they could build this military apparatus. On April 13th, 1982, Senator William Armstrong delivered a speech before the Senate. Here's what he said about East-West trade. Quote, according to Senator Armstrong, in just the last 10 years, the United States and other Western nations have sold the Soviet Union and its satellites more than $50 billion worth of sophisticated technical equipment that the communists could not produce themselves. This equipment has been used to produce nuclear missiles, tanks, armored cars, spy satellites, air defense radar. In addition, the Soviets have been able to purchase entire factories. How did this red machine come into existence? They bought it from the Western world of capitalism. Designed and built by Western engineers and financed in large part by American and European banks. Much of the production of these factories is devoted to the manufacture of military transport, ammunition, and other items for the Soviet war machine. Is the book of Revelation up to date? It is absolute current in the 20th century. So this red horse is literally taking peace from the earth, just like it said in Revelation 6, 3 and 4. Now, let's go even further. A huge portion of our debt in the United States is because we have a deficit spending every year, of which about $208 billion and more, 330-something billion, I think, this year, proposed for 87, goes to the defense of our own country. Now, without the money, the credit line that we supplied to the Soviet Union for up to 15 years at 0% interest and then low interest, 4% after that, the advanced technology, without outright military hardware that the United States has provided to the Soviet Union and continues to provide this instant, the Soviets could not claim a strategic advantage over the United States. It's the billions we've spent for them. Therefore, we have to tax our own people even more to build up our own military apparatus to offset their superiority. So the United States and Western Europe has built the Soviet Red War Machine. In 1973, Soviet dictator Leonid Brezhnev had this to state before his Politburo and the leaders of the Warsaw Pact. I quote, "We communists have got to string along with the capitalists for a while. We need their credit. That's money. That's bank loans. Their agriculture. Did they just purchase this last year over $1 billion worth of grain from the United States? Oh, yes, they did. And yet we have people in this country hungry." He said we need their technology. But we're going to continue massive military programs, and by the middle of the 1980s, that was last year, we will be in a position to return to a more aggressive foreign policy designed to gain the upper hand in our relationship with the West. Do they have that upper hand? We're retreating in every continent on earth, and they're expanding on every continent. And I'll continue the quote. So while the Soviets... No, I'm sorry, I'm through with that quote. While the Soviets now have placed 340 nuclear-tipped mobile SS-20 missiles within striking distance of Western Europe, and while the United States government is only diplomatically slapping the Soviets on the hand for their invasion of Afghanistan, they continue to crush certain things like the Polish labor movement. They continue to supply Cuba with Soviet-made weapons. They continue to send by the millions of dollars worth of equipment into Central and South America, Nicaragua, and so on for the overthrow of those countries. Is the book of Revelation jumping off the pages today? Oh, yes, it is, if you know where to look for it. In a book in 1974 entitled Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, here's what a Mr. Anthony Sutton stated. Quote, "One barrier to mature understanding of recent history is the notion that all capitalists are the bitter and unswerving enemies of all Marxists and socialists." They're not the enemies. They're the suppliers so that this socialism and Marxism can sweep the earth. I'll continue his quote. "This erroneous idea originated with Karl Marx and was useful to his purpose. There has been a continuing, albeit concealed, alliance between international political capitalists, that's the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, international banking, international industrialists such as IBM, International Business Machine, and many others, and international revolutionary socialists to their mutual benefits." So here you have capitalism in the West, the richest people in the West, and international communist socialist movement, one supplying the other. One of them uses the money for the military takeover of the world at the orders of the other. Well, brethren, I'm going to start bringing this to a close, but I want to name just a few of those companies in the Western Hemisphere which should be tried for high treason against the Constitution of the United States. Here's a partial list of those companies that are trading strategic military weapons, technology, and so on with the Soviet Union. Mr. Anthony C. Sutton puts out the Phoenix Letter. He quoted all of this, and all of this is supposed to be super secret and classified by the government of the United States. But he has his own sources within our government, and he published a list of these companies in May of 1982. In the aircraft technology industry, Boeing, Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, and Sikorsky Aircraft all trade freely with the Soviet Union. In the automobile, truck, and agricultural equipment industry, Caterpillar Tractor, Swindler Dressler Company, Rockwell International, International Harvester, Alice Chalmers. And on the board of directors of every one of these companies is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In the metals manufacturing industry, we have American Can Company, Kaiser Industry Corporation, Litton Industries, and I can't pronounce the other one. In the machine tool industry, we have General Electric, Sunstrand Corporation, Bryant Chucking Grinder Company, Bendix Corporation, American Chain and Cable Corporation, and Allen Bradley Corporation. In the electronics industry, there's Honeywell Information Systems, Univac, Control Data, IBM, International Business Machine, the largest in the world, Raytheon, RCA, Coma Corporation, and Hewlett-Packard. In the petroleum, gasoline, and the chemical industry, we have Occidental Petroleum, Tenneco, Monsanto, Alcoa, and Dow Chemical. And in the bankers and financial institutions, Chase Manhattan Bank, and they have always, since 1917, had a branch bank in downtown Moscow. Irvin Trust, Satra Corporation, Tower International, which is controlled by Cyrus Eaton and David Rockefeller. These are just some of the companies that have been helping to finance the Red Revolution all over the world. Now, in bringing this to a conclusion today, in Revelation chapter 18, this is going to be the ultimate end of this whole system that these people are setting up today. Revelation chapter 18, verses 2 to 4. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. And for all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. And the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And it's this system that is producing a world government for merchants. It's a handful of individuals, the elite of the earth, who are controlling the world through economics. And that's why it's going to be a terrifying thing for these rich merchants, because the system is going to collapse around them. Verse 4, And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues. Drop down to the last part of verse 7. For she says in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. This system believes it's going to last from now on. It believes it's got the solution to all problems on earth. It's going to be a counterfeit of the kingdom of God. It's apparently going to bring wealth and happiness to many, many people in comparison to the constant revolutionary wars that are going on and the uprooting of whole populations and famine and starvation. So it's going to bring a solution to the world's problems, seemingly. But it's going to be a false solution. Now verse 10. Standing afar off for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is your judgment come. God is going to judge this system rising, and He will destroy it. Verse 17. Well, you can look at your own time at verse 11, 12, and 13 through there and see all the great merchandising system that they're building up on a global basis. Verse 17 to 21. For in 1 hour so great riches has come to naught, and every shipmaster and all the company in ships and sailors and as many as trade by sea stood afar off, and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like unto this great city? And it is going to be destroyed. Look at verse 20. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. And a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. This system is going to come down. Once this system comes down, you, brethren, are going to have opportunity to rule with Jesus Christ and bring the true kingdom of God to this earth. Revelation 20, verse 4 and 6, and I'll close. And I saw thrones, plural, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. That's the people of God. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus, for the word of God, which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads or in their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. This is your destiny. Don't let anyone ever take that destiny away from you. And the last phrase of verse 6, But they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him for 1,000 years. So yes, the Filipino Islands will fall to international communism. The red horse is riding the earth right now. But the ultimate destiny is it will collapse, and Jesus Christ will rule as King of Kings and Lord of Lords.